Immediately staking a claim in the center, the pawn opens diagonals for pieces and signals an intent to control key squares. Developing the knight to a central outpost immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for further development without committing a central pawn itself. Securing central space and preparing for pawn advances defines this ambitious pawn thrust. Reinforcing the center, d6 prepares to develop the bishop and creates a solid pawn chain, eschewing immediate confrontation for a more flexible setup. Developing a knight to its most active square, reinforcing the center and preparing for further pawn expansion. Safeguarding the knight while preparing its advance, this development subtly fortifies the kingside. Seizing central territory with this pawn push prepares for a powerful kingside assault. Embracing the center, black challenges white's pawn structure and opens lines for immediate piece development. Strengthening the central pawn chain while developing another piece for battle. Embracing the fianchetto, black prepares to activate the bishop on the long diagonal, potentially challenging white's central grip. Solidifying the center and preparing kingside castling, this piece aims to join the defensive structure. Positioning the bishop on this diagonal prepares to castle and aims to control the long-range diagonal after the pawn structure stabilizes. Securing the king's safety through castling immediately activates the rook for future action on central files, a crucial tempo in this king's Indian setup. Solidifying the pawn structure, black mirrors white's safety initiative, preparing for central action. Repositioning the rook to the central file prepares for a potential kingside attack or reinforces the e4 pawn's defense. Solidifying the center's pawn structure, preparing for further central expansion or a queenside initiative. Reorienting the bishop away from the pawn chain opens up new diagonals for potential attacks or defensive maneuvers. Challenging white's queenside space, this pawn push prepares for potential a4 or aims to restrict white's b3-c4 advance. Securing the b-file's reach, white subtly pressures black's queenside development while preparing for a potential pawn break. Consolidating the central pawn structure and preparing for a potential queenside expansion, this move subtly reinforces black's defensive setup. Anchoring the pawn chain, white creates a strong central blockade, restricting black's queenside expansion and building a significant space advantage. Unlocking a central outpost with the knight, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create dynamic play. Securing the queenside pawn chain prevents black's central penetration while opening a retreat square for the knight. Unlocking the queenside pawn structure with this bishop repositioning aims to challenge white's central control. Sacrificing a pawn to disrupt black's central pawn structure and gain initiative on the kingside. Reclaiming the pawn opens lines, preparing to challenge the d5 outpost and activate the knight. Targeting the knight with this bishop aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and potentially gain a tempo for further development. Challenging the bishop's placement directly probes for weaknesses in white's pawn structure and opens lines for potential counterplay. Trading off a bishop for a knight when black's kingside structure is solid opens up the kingside for potential attacks. Reclaiming the queen here solidifies black's central presence and prepares for active piece play, though it does invite potential pressure on the e5 pawn. Unlocking the c-file for the queen creates immediate pressure on black's queenside pawns and eyes a potential breakthrough down the center. Shifting the rook to the c-file intensifies pressure on that open column and prepares for potential piece exchanges. Positioning the rook on the d-file solidifies central control and eyes the undefended black knight. The bishop retreats to a defensive square, but this allows white to exert more pressure on the central files. Asserting control over the d5 outpost drastically enhances white's central pressure. Retreating the queen to d8 relinquishes central influence, potentially isolating it and hindering further queenside counterplay. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure solidifies this area against potential queenside pressure, preparing a more harmonious development for the remaining pieces. Black solidifies the central pawn structure and prepares to contest the d-file, a sensible regrouping after the queenside exchange. Shifting the queen prepares potential pawn pushes on the kingside and reinforces the e4 square. Re-establishing the bishop on its preferred diagonal offers a bit more piece harmony, but it allows white to solidify their central space. Repositioning the knight to c3 hints at a potential queenside expansion, aiming to support an eventual b4 push and challenge black's pawn structure. Sharpening the bishop's diagonal, this challenges white's coordination and seeks better piece interaction for black. Returning the bishop to its original square, it seems white aims to indirectly pressure the weakened kingside by potentially rerouting pieces for an attack. Breaking the queenside pawn structure creates dynamic imbalance and opens avenues for further exploitation. Sacrificing a pawn to forcibly dismantle black's queenside pawns and open lines for your pieces creates immediate tactical pressure. The pawn capture on b3 immediately opens the a-file, potentially creating dynamic counterplay for black's rooks. Opening the file creates immediate pressure on black's queenside structure. The knight's brave sortie to b3 creates a fascinating tactical geometry, potentially ensnaring white's queenside pawns. Simplifying into an endgame now, white aims to exploit the open d-file and potential outpost for the knight, accepting the structural alteration. The rook solidifies its presence on the open file, initiating a strategic endgame with balanced material and clear lines for both sides. Initiating the queenless phase, this exchange strategically simplifies the board, offering chances for rook activity on open files. Trading queens simplifies the position dramatically, ushering in an endgame where the knight on c3 becomes a potential target. Reclaiming the d-file is paramount, aiming to exploit the isolated pawn and initiate a decisive kingside attack. Probing the open file with the rook opens up a strategic battle for central influence. Repositioning the knight to the isolated pawn creates a flexible threat. Re-establishing the bishop's presence on the long diagonal offers better piece harmony and potentially threatens the knight. Reinforcing the d-file pressure and preparing for a potential rook lift sets a strategic vice. Bringing the knight to the center creates a powerful outpost, though it might invite pawn advances. Exchanging knights simplifies the position, paving the way for a clearer endgame where white's passed pawn might become decisive. Reclaiming the pawn opens a pathway for your rook, aiming to disrupt white's centralized knight. Activating the knight to a powerful central outpost, eyeing black's advanced pawns. Unleashing a central pawn, black ignites a critical fight for control of the d-file. Reclaiming the initiative, white boldly targets the weakened pawns with a decisive knight maneuver, forcing black's pieces to the back rank. Seizing the open file and creating immediate pressure on the white king's position is the primary objective here. Sacrificing the knight opens a clear path for the d-pawn, potentially creating a decisive passed threat. Opening the f-file offers a crucial long-term outlet for your rook, even if the immediate pawn structure appears fractured. Repositioning the bishop to guard the pawn chain and prepare for potential breakthroughs. The bishop vacates its retreat square, preparing to redeploy and bolster the d-pawn's advance. Exchanging the bishop eliminates a potential attacking piece and simplifies into a winning endgame. Capturing the pawn ignites a tactical skirmish, aiming to disrupt white's centralized king and potentially activate black's rooks. A cautious king repositioning, seeking a safer haven from the bishop's diagonal pressure. Reclaiming the open file now allows for potential pressure on white's isolated pawn. A quiet regrouping, aiming to reposition the bishop for defense on the king's side and prepare for further pawn pushes. Solidifying the pawn chain with this advance offers the bishop increased scope and aims to restrict white's central influence. Securing the king's safety by creating an escape square before any potential knight maneuvers offers a valuable defensive resource. Safeguarding the monarch on its current square is a priority, as the opponent's bishop now eyes that critical area. Securing the rook's repositioning on an open file to apply pressure along the queenside ranks. Repositioning the rook to a more active square aims to exploit white's slightly awkward bishop placement. Solidifying central pawn structure secures the bishop and prepares to exploit the open files. Contesting the now open rook file with the black rook aims to disrupt white's potential pawn advances. Repositioning the bishop to f1 offers a safer square and prepares to defend the d3 pawn if challenged. Pondering the king's safety amidst this material imbalance seems a wise decision. Opening up lines toward the king is a tactical gamble that may prove decisive if the opponent can't react sufficiently. King emerges from its shell, seeking activity but exposing itself to open lines. Shifting the bishop to guard the critical light squares and prepare for potential pawn advances. A desperate check, seeking any respite as the king becomes critically exposed. Securing the king's escape route through g3 is a pragmatic decision given the active rook on the first rank. A clever repositioning of the bishop to defend the c-pawn, subtly reinforcing its kingside presence. Activating the bishop here seizes an open file, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create immediate tactical threats against the weakened king. Recapturing the pawn offers little compensation for the exposed black king and the open lines white now controls. Actively consolidating your king's safety against the advancing pawn structure is paramount now. Unlocking the b-file opens avenues for the rook, potentially targeting weaknesses in white's pawn structure and forcing a reactive defense. Initiating the pawn thrust to dislodge the bishop and potentially create weaknesses in black's pawn shield. Securing the 7th rank with the rook prevents further inroads and aims to support the isolated pawn. Gaining the open file is paramount here. The bishop's redeployment now secures the critical d3 pawn, solidifying black's pawn structure and potentially opening new avenues for counterplay. Positioning the bishop to the only square where it can defend the pawn and potentially pressure the black king is crucial now. King activation is paramount now, heading towards the center to participate in the endgame skirmish. Establishing outpost control on the queen's flank, aiming to restrict black's advancing pawns and create defensive flexibility. Unleashing the central pawn offers black counterplay by opening lines towards white's king. Restoring the bishop to its central outpost solidifies white's endgame advantage and prepares for pawn advancement. Opening lines for white's king, black now mobilizes the queenside pawns to seize space and disrupt white's development. The bishop finds a superior outpost, ready to support the pawn's advance and restrict the black king. Prioritizing piece activity over pawn structure, black seeks to reactivate their bishop and exploit the open files. Dominating the central square after the exchange, this bishop eyes the pawn chain's weakness. Unleashing the pawn's potential, this advance aims to disrupt white's bishop coordination and grab more territory. Pawn structure weakening continues, a desperate attempt to disrupt black's consolidated pawn chain. Shifting the bishop to this square subtly supports a potential kingside pawn push while guarding against any immediate threats. Pawns now hold sway, seeking central pawn majority superiority. The monarch vacates its protected square, venturing into a more exposed central zone. Shifting the bishop to b1 offers an improved defensive posture, anticipating black's pawn push and securing the pawn on b5. Unlocking the passed pawn's potential becomes paramount now. It demands constant vigilance and strategic maneuvering. Shifting the king to a more active central square can initiate endgame pawn play. The black king ventures out, seeking activity, but exposes itself to potential discovery threats on the light squares. Unblocking the bishop allows for potential pawn pushes and maneuvering, aiming to exploit black's exposed king. Finding a safe harbor for the king is paramount before advancing the pawn. Opening the king's path to the queenside promises exciting developments. Abandoning the bishop's active post to the wing grants white undisputed central influence. Chasing the black king into the open with the rook now frees up white's own monarch. This pawn's advance is the last gasp of resistance, striving to create a queening threat before the inevitable capture. Capturing the pawn opens a direct path to black's king and simplifies the board, aiming to leverage white's material advantage. A new queen emerges, aiming to disrupt the white king's exposed position and threaten immediate counterplay. Eliminating the queen's pawn opens up the bishop to deliver a decisive check.